here with Pam Pritchett, who had an unfortunate situation almost 5 months ago. Her mother, Pearl Young, shot and killed in that awful Tops massacre on May 14th, 2022. I'm so glad that you're with me.
Thank you so much for having me, Ed. I appreciate it, as always. Thank you for extending the invitation. For me, it's all about just talking about my mom and keeping who she is out there and not the way she died out there. So I appreciate it.
Tell me what you most loved about your mom. Tell me about your mom and how she was kind of, this joy in life.
Oh, I mean, it's so many things. I'll start off with something funny, okay? So my mom, at the house I grew up in, she had a chair that she sat in that looked right out like she could see everyone who's coming in the house. So we called it Command Central because from where she is, all she could do is like look, and she would know if you were sneaking to go up the stairs or sneak into the sunroom. So like whenever I talk about my mom, it's those type of funny things like that. And me and my kids, we talk about it even to this. Right now, we go in her house, and there's Command Central. So it's like those little things like that that first of all, it makes a person so real. And it makes them who they are,
sure.
And it takes away from just what happened, and it shows the humanity in the person. So my mom was that. She was Command Central. My brothers, we called her the Bank of Pearl because she would let us borrow money even when we were adults. Like I was older. You know what I'm saying? Okay. And so I was like, Mom, I need to borrow something. My refrigerator broke. And she'd take out her little folder, and she, like, okay, well, Pam, it's gonna cost you $1,500, and like every week I'd come back, I'd be like, here's 75 or whatever, and she literally had it, and she was like marking it off, okay, from 1,500 to 1,425, and at the bottom, she had like paid in full. I mean, she was just like, like if you were going to Orville's or something like that, without the interest, but
yeah. But she meant business.
She meant business. Like there was no like joke with that. She would call you up after. She's like, oh, "Where's my money?"
Mm-hmm.
But it's those simple things like that with my mom that like it brings me joy, just to think about her from that light. How much she loved us. She loved my brothers, loved my children, all of her grandchildren, I should say. But mine's especially because I'm the only daughter, so I get a one-up on my brothers. But, just those wonderful things about her. And, those things you miss more than anything. But, like, if you were to ask me, those are my first two ones that always come to mind.
Sure.
Because it makes me smile. It makes me smile to remember her that way. And, she had a way, we went on a trip to Alabama, and me and my mom and my brother were figuring out how much money we all spent. And I was like, well, Mom, I owe you $150 on gas. And she was like, Pammy, only she can call me Pammy. Pammy, we're not talking about that right now. Right now, we're talking about how much we are splitting for the rental, So it was just things like that,
She kept you focused and on task.
Oh, yeah. She was like, this is not what we're on right now. And like I said, she's the only one who got away with calling me Pammy, but...
Well, let me ask you this. So you walk into her house, and you mentioned that you see that one chair. Mm-hmm. And to me, I would look at the chair and say, wow, I really miss my mom, and I really miss what would come out of that chair. What is it like for you to kind of walk in there? Do you hear her voice when you walk in? Do you miss something in particular? What is it about that one area that when you see it, you're like,
it's interesting because that, and I will say, like, that was the chair that my brother purchased her. So after she died, he got the chair and took it to where he lived because he wanted that memory. So we have another chair in the same place, though. But it's interesting because when I go in, it doesn't bring me like a sense of melancholy or anything like that. It's just almost like a reminder of, okay, this is where my mom used to sit, and this is what she used to do when she was in that chair. So it brings me I don't want to say a sense of joy, but I'm not saddened either because the memory of that is a positive one. And I think it's important whenever you're dealing with grief like this is to have the memories be be close to positive, because if you don't, then it takes you down a road that you don't want to go down. So when I think about Command Central, as I call it, what it goes to mind is how many times we tried to sneak up the stairs and she caught us. And I'm not talking about when we were teenagers. I'm talking about when I was an adult, So like going into her house and thinking about that, it brings back a positive memory.
When we talk about Pearl Young, we know she was the epitome of faith. She dedicated her life to others and helping others. And that morning, that Saturday morning, she had already been at a prayer breakfast. And I think that it's so important to point that out, that on one hand, she was serving a higher power, and then later that day, she was called to a higher power. That is so powerful and profound.
Absolutely. And for me, like, I have to look at that in from that perspective, because if I don't, then my mind goes places that I don't want it to go. But I not only think about the fact that my mom was at a prayer breakfast that morning, and I know like there are all types of photos and things like that, but I also think about the fact that while she was there, she was enjoying family and friends, and my mom's best friend was there, and so they're having conversation. And I like to think that God in his infinite grace allowed her to have that conversation with people who she loved the most. Now, for me, it's kind of tough because I wasn't there, but that's the part of me. Like my mother, I'm a person of strong faith. I think you have to have a certain degree of faith in order to even navigate something like this, because it's just so completely unexpected. But I really try to, I get a lot of strength from her. And I know, in the depths of my heart, that my mother would not want me to just focus on one aspect of her life, that she would want me to show her in all these multifaceted ways. So yes, I talk about her and what she did with her Sunday school class and the food pantry. But like we were talking just now, I like to talk about the funny things that she did and the way she made us laugh. My mom would make Thanksgiving dinners and Christmas and all that, and the day before, she'd say, I don't have time. I'm not making all this food, Penny. And I'm like, well, Mom, you don't have to. We're just going to get together. We'll have, we'll laugh and have fun. And then I get there the next day and she's like, I made Gregory meatloaf. I made Oriana collard greens. I made Nathaniel yams. Pammy, I didn't make you anything. Oh. But it's so funny because the day before she's like, I can't do it. And I'm like, Mom, you don't have to. I'm okay. We're just going to get together. And then we get there and then laughingly she's like, I couldn't make you anything, but Pammy is for the grandkids anyway.
Well, let me ask you this. So, I mean, we're coming up on the holiday season. What do you think this year is going to look like? I mean, we are a month and a half away from Thanksgiving right now. You have a lot to be thankful for in terms of her memories. But what does this Thanksgiving look like for you?
I honestly don't know. I don't know. And I try not to make myself think too hard on that.
Sure.
Because I think if I think too hard on it, it will produce maybe something negative or just something more that will cause me more hurt. So I try not to think too much on that. Instead, I try to let it just come along,
day by day.
Day by day. So like me and my children, we were talking about that, and like my son Nate was like, Mom, I'm going to try to learn how to make yams like Grandma did. And so I was like, okay, but I don't think too hard on it. I don't. I just feel like what will come, and that however it happens around that holiday time, that somehow it's going to come together. It has to, you know, and that's the way I look at it. I don't let myself go that far out because I think you set yourself up. You know, if I set myself up and I start saying, oh, I'm going to miss my mom, I'm going to miss this, I'm going to miss that, then I'm setting myself up already. And I don't know, like there might just be a possibility that God is going to do something for me that lifts my heart. But if I set myself up with already thinking negatively, then I don't leave space for something positive to possibly happen. So,
Where do you find this kind of mindset? Because I think for so many people it would be so easy to dwell on the grief, but it's like you've picked yourself up and you really have found the will to move forward.
you know, like I said, I know I always tell people I am definitely a person of faith, but I also just honestly believe that at the end of the day, we do have the power to think differently. I mean, we have to almost get up with the mindset. Like, my birthday was recent, and of all days, like, that's the day I was kind of crying because I was thinking about, you know, this was the first birthday I had without my mom. But I didn't get up that very morning saying I'm going to think that way. It hit me, and I know it's going to hit me, you know, on other occasions.
How did it hit you? What was that like for you?
You know, so I'm getting up. My kids are giving me my birthday gifts and all these things like that. And I just put something on Facebook, and I was like, you know, while I'm celebrating my birthday, this is the first birthday without my mom. And I will kind of put something where, like, I could hear her voice calling me. And again, this goes to, I think, sometimes seeing the joy in something instead of always seeing the pain all the time. Not to say the pain isn't there, I'm pretending that it's not. But on my birthday, I imagined her calling me saying, Pammy, where are we going to eat? You know, so even with the pain of missing her, I hear her voice in my head, and the voice that I hear is a voice of joy and of happiness. So it's like on the one hand, I'm crying, but on the other hand, I'm remembering the person that she was and the way she called me. You know, she, like, I know on my birthday, she'd have been like, well, if I can't take you out today, Pammy, you know we don't pick days. You know, your birthday's the 27th, but that's okay. We celebrate all month long, Pammy. You know, things like that. So it's kind of like on my birthday, I missed her, but I was hearing her voice at the same time. So it brought a certain level of comfort.
It's got to feel really special.
Yeah, so.
You mentioned, Pam, that you hadn't been back to that Tops on Jefferson Avenue until recently.
Right.
Almost 5 months later. Tell me about that.
I went back on Saturday, and I can honestly say it wasn't something that was necessarily planned. We'd had a meeting about the preservation of the area, and I drove home, and I got out my car and went in the house, and then I was like, you know what, I'm going to go to Tops today. And so I drove over there, parked in the lot, walked around, and like I was a little nervous. I think this goes again to sometimes making sure you don't set yourself up to feel like you're going to fall apart. And so even as I was driving over there, I knew I was going to cry, but I didn't go in there with the mentality that I'm not going to be able to take this. Now, this is just me. I know people who can't go, and I get it. But for me, and walking around there, I went and I saw pictures of my mom, and I certainly cried because this was the first time I was there. But I didn't experience this overwhelming amount of grief. And I think that that didn't happen for me because I knew who my mother was. I knew the life that she lived. And even in all the pain that I feel, and it hurts so much to think about the way my mom died, that she was killed. But I hold fast, and if you don't mind me telling this little story real quick, this helps me, like, because when you're dealing with something that traumatic and you're wondering, what was my mom's last thoughts? But there was a story I used to read in the Bible where a man was being murdered, stoned to death, and the Bible verse says that he fell asleep. And I have to believe that God in his infinite grace allowed my mother to fall asleep, that it wasn't something where she was racked in fear and pain. And that's where your faith steps in. It has to. Because if it doesn't, you lose it. And I'm not going to do that. So
When you walk back there and you realize, and you mention yourself how you realized in the manner or the manner in which your mother was killed.
yeah.
But there's a whole backstory to this. This didn't just happen. Police say this was planned.
Oh, absolutely.
Police say this was racially motivated, and that this store in particular was targeted. And to think that somebody was targeted because of the color of their skin, which again is what police say is the case. I mean, here we are 5 months later, and I mentioned this to you in a conversation earlier. It's like we're marking, okay, it's 5 months, it's 6 months, it's 7 months. It'll be a year, it'll be 2 years, it'll be 3 years, it'll be 10 years at some point. But the conversation has to come back to what the root cause was, and that's racism.
Absolutely. And I think that's why we have to be careful about always dating something 6 months, 7 months, because it takes away from the truth. The truth of the matter is this was white supremacy. This was a person who believed that the color of his skin made him better than someone else. This was a issue where he believed in this whole idea of replacement theories and all of these things. And I think it is important that we keep at the root the reason why this person did what he did, the reason why he came to our city and came to that particular location was because he was looking to kill black people. He was looking to murder black people because of his racism and his hatred. And I'll say this because this is something that really sticks with me a lot, Ed. I'm going to kind of pivot for a minute. But it upsets me that people continue to refer to this as a tragedy. Because when you do that, you take away the significance of what really happened. No, this was not just a tragedy. This was an act of racism, of white supremacy, and you have to call it what it is. We can't move forward like you were talking about. How can we as a community, we as a nation, we can't move forward if we can't call something by its name. And so you don't get to use words like tragedy to describe this because that's not what it is. I'm not saying that it wasn't tragic, but that's not the root cause of it. It's racism. And so when I listen to politicians and I see them use the word tragic all the time, I say to myself, you are so weak. You're so weak because you're unwilling to call something what you know it is. This man had a manifesto. You don't get to be comfortable by calling it something that makes you a little more at ease. You have to be willing to call it what it is. It doesn't make you a white supremacist to call something white supremacy. It just makes you a person that's willing to use the word that truly describes what happened.
Well, so where do we go? I mean, this is like, we can't forget that it was racism, as you mentioned. So how do we bring this to the forefront? How do we say, and how do we confront this? How do we say, this can't happen? We need to put this behind us. We need to know the history here, but we have to be bigger and better than that. How do we do that?
I say this, as comfortable as that man was in his hate, we have to be just as uncomfortable in coming out of our uneasiness about it.
What do you mean?
In other words, okay, he was comfortable in his actions. So now we have to make ourselves uncomfortable to get an action that will move us forward. And so that requires us to get really uneasy. It requires us to stretch ourselves in a manner that we've never stretched ourselves before. And when you start talking about things like that, then what happens is it moves us from the surface and it takes us, I don't like to even just say to a deeper place, but it moves us somewhere where we have to start looking on the inside of ourselves and asking ourselves, why don't I want to call it white supremacy? What makes me so uncomfortable with those words? Because that's when we start really having real conversation. Why can't I call it what it was? Is it because if I say that word, I feel like somehow that's who I am? Because that's not how I'm looking at you. If you acknowledge it as white supremacy, I'm not looking at you and going, oh, see, yeah, So you have to be uncomfortable enough to say that word and understand that I'm not going to look at you differently for saying it, for calling it what it is. And I think people get very uneasy when you use words like that.
What is white supremacy to you?
For me, white supremacy is the actions of this man on the 14th. For me also, here I go.
Go for
White
it.
supremacy is when you don't want to acknowledge that something happened that was that. When you want to call it a tragedy, that's white supremacy. Because what you're doing is you're saying, okay, in order to make myself more comfortable, I'm going to lessen your pain for my comfort. That's supremacy.
Do you think you would ever hear a black person call this a tragedy?
I don't like to say that you wouldn't. I have heard some black people who have referred to it as a tragedy. But I think that if you were to ask, especially in our community and those of us who know the story, we may say it's a tragedy too, but we're going to also say it's an act of white supremacy. Now, for me personally, I'm going to say white supremacy on the top of it. And not to take away from tragedy, but it is what it is.
You know, I never really thought about it like that either. You know, you kind of bring up a good point here that it is the act of taking away from the pain that gives somebody who's not in that situation, not black, not in that community, not part of the story, the ability to minimize what happened.
Right. Exactly, yes. And you don't get to minimize our pain to make it easy for you. Because, okay, this is another thing. How do we move forward? You have to recognize our pain, accept that you can't lessen it by using different words. And words matter. Words matter. And so when you use the word tragedy instead of the word white supremacy, they matter, because I'm not taking away from other mass shootings where we use the word tragedy. But then you have this where it was strategic, where it was, okay, I'm going to this community where I know it's over 80% Black Americans, and this is where I'm choosing to go. So I think we can't get around that. We have to face it head on. That's the only way we really move forward, is we have to face things head on. I mean, at the end of the day, no matter what sometimes I like to just keep it really simple. Like if you're in school and you're having a difficult time with a class, you can either pretend like you're not, or you can say, I'm gonna take this head on, and I'm gonna go and see my professor or my teacher. My son's in high school. I'm gonna go to the study halls. I'm gonna go to the library. I'm gonna do all those things in order to improve, to pass. Well, it's the same thing. Okay, let's have conversations. Because if we don't have conversations, then we end up in the same place. And it's kind of like, do you want to repeat the same grade again? When I believe that we have an opportunity in Western New York to show the nation how it should be done, how we should try to reconnect, how we should try, even when it's uncomfortable, to talk about things. I believe, and maybe that's the part of me that has this crazy amount of optimism and hope and faith, that if we can simply really talk, be honest with each other, have conversations like this, I believe that we can move forward. But the first thing you have to do is you have to acknowledge what happened. You don't, and I'm going to say this, I'll just keep it out there, because we have people who are running for office. We have a congressman who's running for governor, and I happened to read his, on May 14th, he calls it a tragedy. He says, oh, we're so sorry about the tragedy that happened in Buffalo, New York. But on May 18th, when he has the opportunity to sign the domestic terrorism bill, he votes against it. You don't get, that's why I said you don't get to cause something tragic, and then a couple of days later, when you have an opportunity to take what you said and put it into action, you don't. And you come up with all these reasons why you voted against the domestic terrorism bill, knowing that domestic terrorism is on the rise, and that if we're going to be honest, it's on the rise against black people. It is very much racially motivated, and in our country over the last maybe 5-6 years, it has changed. The way we treat each other, the words that we use toward each other, it has changed. And again, I think that, again, when you start looking within, you have to start asking yourself, when did this happen? When did we become so callous toward each other? That has to do with it.
You think it contributes to what we've experienced as a community?
Absolutely. I believe that over the last 4, 5, 6 years, a callousness has occurred in our nation. It's occurred in all of our communities. And so things that maybe we would have been more careful and we would have been more considerate to say, we just feel like we can say whatever we want to now. And that emboldens a person who is already filled with racism if they hear and believe they're being emboldened even more to now act out the way this person did. And I'll just be honest and say, I think even our politicians over the years, I always say that there used to be a time, I used to watch politicians from the time it was Ronald Reagan and on. Oh my gosh, I'm kind of dating myself. But I always took note that whenever they had to speak before the people, they always, you could see them going, and they would take a moment before they said a word, because they knew that what they said, the words they used, had power. And then all of a sudden you see politicians now, and they just say whatever they want to say. They don't think about what their words mean. And that's something that I think that led to a callousness in our nation, because when you don't think about what you're going to say, and you just kind of talk off the top of your head, you just can't do that. You have to think about, how are your words going to affect somebody?
Kind of like with racial undertones.
Yes, absolutely. You know, deal with me on this one here. Go Ed, okay. The Bible says to be quick to hear and slow to speak. So we need to listen more and not talk so quickly. And I've noticed that politicians just kind of say whatever they want to say now without thinking, okay, if I use these words, what is it going to mean to the masses, or what is it going to mean to people who already are angry? So we have to do that. We have to think better. I want to say, not even for politicians, even for all of us every day, we have to think about the words that we use when we're talking to people, the words that we use when we're in conversations, because they matter. They matter.
It sounds like what you're saying is even call out racism in everyday conversation, call out injustice.
Absolutely. I think call out injustice, call out racism, but not only those two things, but be aware of why we think the way we think. There's an author, and she talks about how the problems, she talks about stereotypes. She says stereotypes, the problem with them is that they are incomplete. And so there's a level of truth to any stereotype, but there's also a lot that's incomplete. And so what we have is a lot of people who are putting all these stereotypes out there, and they're counting them as being truths when they're not.
Painting everyone with a broad brush.
Broad. And even more than that, it's almost like with a stereotype, because there's an element of truth to it, now you're able to explode that element of truth to where you want it to be.
It becomes your truth as opposed to the truth.
Exactly, exactly. So I think that those are things that are important. And this, again, goes back to when we start talking about racism and we start talking about the conversations. Then we have to deal with what are our stereotypes about black people, our stereotypes about people who are Hispanic or Asian American. It doesn't matter. What are the stereotypes that we say in our house quietly when no one else is around, or we say with our brother or sister who we think, we can get away with saying that joke or whatever. We have to hold ourselves accountable for that. We got to change the way we think. We got to change who we are as people. And that takes work. I mean,
sometimes that work is uncomfortable, though.
and it's, oh my gosh, yeah, it's like really uncomfortable. And I tell people all the time, there are conversations that I have that I am uncomfortable with, but
Like what?
like my children and I were having a conversation, and my son and I were talking about a conversation regarding responsibility and accountability within the Black American culture. And so my son is very much a person who's like, people need to take accountability, Mom. And so I'm from the generation of remembering the crack epidemic. And so I have maybe a little bit more empathy. But my son is like, well, Mom, this is 2022. And people need to say, you know what addiction did, so why would you pick up a crack pipe again? Now, I'm like, well, no, Nate, but it stretches me a little bit.
And that goes beyond just drugs, too.
Mm-hmm.
It goes, I'm sure, into childbirth. It goes into all sorts of aspects of familial life.
Yeah, so those are the type of things that I feel stretch you, because it makes you have to even step back and say to myself, okay, do I need to be a more accountable for the actions that I make, the decisions that I make? And I think that those things are important. This is why, like I was telling you before, I'll never be a good politician, because I can see two sides of an issue. And I think sometimes one side only wants you to see the issue from their side. But we have to get to the truth. So let's say in our Black community, if we want to get to the truth, then we have to say the Black community is built up by the Black family. And so if we want our community to be strong, then we have to encourage our stronger Black family. That gets me in trouble sometimes, because people don't always want to hear that part of the story, because then that starts going into accountability. When you start to talk about, well, what are you doing to help build us up as a community?
But there's accountability on both sides.
On both sides, on both sides. And I strongly believe that. I strongly believe that in order for us to move forward as a community, not only as a Black community, but as a community and as a whole, then we have to take the truths, no matter what they are, and we have to make a change on them. And that gets me in trouble sometimes, because then I start going into organizations that I feel like are not as productive to the Black community as I think they can be.
Do you want to name names?
Sure. This is going to get me in trouble, but I'm going to say it. I believe organizations, from the surface level, I believe in Black Lives Matter in terms of what it stands for, but I believe organizationally there's a lot that needs to be changed. I believe that organizationally, any organization that does not acknowledge the importance of a father in a home, I don't believe that that's best for us in the long term in terms of building each other up as a community. And so I have problems with things like that. And I know it gets me in trouble sometimes. So I can honestly say I believe in what BLM stands for. But on an organizational level, I feel like it is so important to have a man, a father in the home for sons and for daughters. And I think really, and I think I've shared with this story with you, my husband passed away, but during the time he was there, he taught my sons how to handle racism, because racism is real. And so my son had an experience on his job where he experienced blatant racism. But what he'd been taught by his father allowed him to go back in the next day to work without, feeling oppressed, because his father had raised him to say, no, son, you're not oppressed, but you call out the racism when you see it. I think I was saying this a little bit to you that with my son. So I said to my son, I said, well, remember what your dad taught you? And I said, this woman who behaved in this racist manner, I said, just let your eyes just follow her all throughout the store. Like, not in a mean way, but just the look of, yeah, I'm going to make you remember what you did every time you see me. You're not going to get away with pretending. Because this woman who was racist toward my son, when everything came together, she wouldn't even apologize to him. She went to the manager and apologized. She went and purchased some fancy gourmet cookies and gave them to the manager. But she didn't apologize to my son, and he was the one who was the victim of her racism. And so he came back, but I said, no, I said, just let her see your eyes I said, is she a regular? He said, yeah, she comes. I said, every time she walks in, just let her know that your eyes are on her so that she remembers the decision that she made when she decided to racially profile you. But I said to him, I said, did you feel oppressed? He said, no. I said, that's right. That's how you take your power. You have your power by when someone does something that's wrong racially, you make them uncomfortable. And that's what we teach my sons and my daughters, and my daughter, excuse me. When someone does something that's racially profiling and you have the opportunity, and I'm talking about from a person on an individual level, because I know it's different when you start talking about systemic, but on an individual level, when you have that opportunity, I think you have to make them uncomfortable with the decision that they made. And, okay, so if we're going to talk about it from a community standpoint, I think you do the same thing. I think that you make it uncomfortable by saying, we're going to have this conversation. Like I said,
we're going to park right
here. We're going to park. Oh, see, that's right. We're going to park right here. No, there's no pivoting. We're parking right here, and this is the conversation that we're having. I think that's important, So even with May 14th and my mother, and I've had this conversation too, I don't let people get away with saying my mother passed away. No, she didn't. My mother was murdered. Because that's a way of making you comfortable. It's comfortable for you to say, oh, your mom passed away, Pam. No, she didn't. I know what passed away looked like. I experienced passed away with my father. We all knew that he was going, the nurse had said he might have a few more days, so our whole family got together and we were there. We knew he was going to pass away. Even my husband, and it was unexpected, but I was able to go up and touch his skin, and there was still warmth in his blood. But I didn't get this with my mother, and so you don't get to minimize my pain by using a word like passed away, because when I went to the funeral home, because I needed to have closure, my mother wasn't, her entire face wasn't even close to what she looked like. And I tell people that sometimes I'm almost envious, Ed, because people can put up pictures of my mother in her joy and happiness. And I can't even post those on my page yet because my memory is still the funeral home, okay? So I struggle every day with trying my best every day to even though that's in my memory, but to also try to remember her in all of her beauty. But I will say, I am envious sometimes. I'll go on Facebook and people have pictures of her, you know, and I'm like, but that's not the last memory that I have. The memory of my mom in the casket is totally different than what other people had. So that's why I say, people, you don't get to minimize that, because it is a painful thing when you go to a funeral home and a person that you love doesn't look anything physically, anything. Like when I went to the funeral home, I thought to myself, well, maybe she'll look a little different, but Ed, physically, to see that, that's why I say people don't get to minimize it, because unless you've been there with the person that you love that much, does her whole facial structure, and they did the best they could, but her whole facial structure wasn't anything like the mom who I was having a conversation with that Thursday. So no, I don't let people get away with using words like passed away, because sometimes when a person passes away and you go to the funeral home, the funeral director is able to do things so that person still looks like them. I didn't get that. And that's where my faith has to step in, so that I don't stay at the funeral home, that I have to try to see outside of that. So, yeah.
I think that you are incredibly brave for coming forward and sharing your story, and I'm so gracious and grateful that you've been so candid with me. And I'm always thinking of you and the other 10 families, and or the other 9 families. And I hope that we can move forward as a society and kind of say racism is not okay, and we need to call it out for what it is.
And you know what? I think we can. I think we can do it the more we have people see each other just as brothers and sisters. I say this all the time. I say, God is an amazing, infinite, He's amazing, because I don't care whether you're young or old, you're black or white, you're gay or straight, doesn't matter. God in his infinite wisdom made it so that all our tears are clear. If I were to take a bottle and you were crying and your tears were gathered, and I took a bottle and mine were, you're not going to be able to say, well, this is a white person's tears, and this is. So God in his infinite grace was like, okay, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make everybody's tears clear. I want to make it so that everybody has that thing in their commonality. And what are tears? Tears are about grief. Tears are about when something happens to us that brings us sorrow or sometimes brings us pain. And when those tears come, they don't have colors. They're just clear. I just believe that God wanted us to see it that way. You know, so.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you. You're amazing.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you.